The oldest known human fossils were not found in Europe or Asia, they were found in Africa. That fact alone has shaped everything scientists now understand about where our species came from. Homo sapiens, the species that all living people belong to, first appeared on the African continent somewhere between 300,000 and 360,000 years ago. The evidence for this comes from two separate lines of research, the fossil record and genetic analysis, and both have arrived at the same conclusion independently. Researchers working in paleoanthropology and population genetics have spent decades collecting data from sites spread across dozens of countries. The picture they've assembled points consistently back to Africa. The story doesn't begin with Homo sapiens, though. It begins millions of years earlier, with earlier members of the human family tree who were already walking upright on African soil long before our own species existed. One of the most well-known examples is a skeleton found in Ethiopia in 1974, belonging to a species called Australopithecus afarensis. That individual, dated to roughly 3.2 million years ago, demonstrated that bipedal locomotion developed in Africa well before the emergence of larger brains or stone tool use. Fossils of Homo habilis found in Tanzania push the lineage forward to about 2.8 million years ago. The oldest fossils attributed to the broader human lineage stretch back somewhere between 6 and 7 million years, to roughly the period when the ancestors of humans and chimpanzees are estimated to have diverged. All of those fossils were found in Africa. A species called Homo erectus appeared around 2 million years ago, also in Africa. It's notable for a few reasons. It had a more modern body shape than its predecessors and a larger brain. It produced a category of tools called the Acheulean toolkit that included hand axes that required planning and deliberate shaping. Homo erectus was also the first member of the human lineage known to have left Africa. Fossils assigned to this species have been found in Asia and parts of Europe, showing that the movement of hominins out of Africa is not a recent development in evolutionary terms. What's significant, however, is that the oldest fossils of our own species, Homo sapiens, were not found in those regions. Fossil sites in Europe and Asia have produced Homo sapiens remains, but none of those specimens come close in age to what's been recovered in Africa. Among the most important African specimens are the Omo I remains, discovered in southwestern Ethiopia in the Omo Kibish Formation, an area located within the East African Rift Valley. Earlier dating estimates placed those fossils at under 200,000 years old. More recent research, based on a massive volcanic eruption that deposited a datable layer of ash across the region, established that the Omo I remains had to predate that eruption. That occurred approximately 230,000 years ago. The skull of Omo I is anatomically modern in its overall shape, meaning that people living in Eastern Africa 230,000 years ago already looked much like people living today. The East African Rift Valley was an especially active geological environment during the period when Homo sapiens was emerging. Enormous volcanic eruptions occurred repeatedly across the region between roughly 360,000 and 100,000 years ago, depositing thick layers of ash that made some areas temporarily uninhabitable. Those eruptions also collected rainfall in low-lying areas, lakes that attracted animals, and made certain zones highly livable between eruptions. Scientists have suggested that the instability of this environment may have actually shaped human evolution by forcing groups of people to move around, encounter each other, exchange both genes and technologies. A second set of remains found alongside Omo I at the same site, referred to as Omo II, appears to be roughly the same age, but has a more archaic skull shape. That has prompted debate about whether it truly represents Homo sapiens or something slightly earlier in the lineage. The presence of both individuals at the same site, with different physical characteristics, fits with a broader emerging picture of early human evolution as something more complex than a single origin point branching outward in a clean line. Genetic research has added a substantial amount of detail to what the fossils suggest. A study published in Nature in 2023 compared genetic material from present-day African populations with the fossil evidence. It produced a model of human evolution that looks less like a simple tree and more like a network, with multiple populations across Africa developing in partial isolation and then mixing periodically over hundreds of thousands of years. Those populations are estimated to have begun diverging from one another around 120,000 to 135,000 years ago, but they continued exchanging genes long after that divergence began. One piece of genetic evidence that has been discussed for several decades involves mitochondrial DNA. That is passed from mothers to children and doesn't mix with the fat as genetic material the way most DNA does. After analysing 133 types of mitochondrial DNA from populations around the world, researchers concluded that all of them trace back to a single female ancestor who lived in Africa. That individual is commonly referred to in the scientific literature as mitochondrial Eve. Though the name is somewhat misleading, she wasn't the only woman alive at the time, just the one whose mitochondrial lineage survived unbroken to the present day. One of the clearest pieces of genetic evidence for an African origin is the distribution of genetic diversity across modern human populations. African populations today carry more genetic variation than any other group of people on the planet. Populations outside Africa contain only a subset of the diversity found within Africa. That is exactly what scientists would expect if a relatively small group of people left the continent and their descendants spread across the rest of the world. The estimated timing of that dispersal, based on genetic analysis, is approximately 70,000 years ago. That departure involved a small enough group to create a genetic bottleneck, meaning the people who left carried only a portion of the variation that existed among African populations at the time. Every non-African population alive today is descended from those early migrants. Southern Africa carries a particularly deep layer of human genetic history. Research published in 2024 documented roughly 9,000 years of genetic continuity in the southernmost part of the continent. Earlier work found that population separation between southern Africa and other parts of Africa may have existed for at least 300,000 years, possibly as long as 1 million years. A study examining the genomes of 28 ancient individuals from southern Africa who lived between approximately 150 and 10,200 years ago identified 79 DNA variants that alter gene function and appear unique to Homo sapiens, variants absent from Neanderthals, Denisovans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. Ancient southern African individuals dated to more than 1,400 years before the present showed genetic profiles that fall outside the range of variation seen in any modern human population, including the Khoisan people of southern Africa today. Among the genetic variants found in those ancient individuals, several were associated with protection against ultraviolet light, suggesting that specific adaptations developed within that population over a long period of isolation. The broader evidence from southern Africa reinforces what the fossil record and genetics elsewhere on the continent show: that Africa was home to multiple human populations for an extraordinarily long time, that those populations developed in relative isolation and periodic contact with one another, that all living humans descend from ancestors who belong to that African network. The oldest purported hominin fossils, dating to somewhere around 6 to 7 million years ago, were recovered from African sites. The most recent genetic analyses consistently show that the deepest roots of human diversity are found on the same continent.